Part 1. Crossroads of Fate. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window, casting soft, golden beams across the granite countertops. Emilia stood by the coffee machine, scrolling through emails on her phone. The rhythmic hum of the machine filled the silence, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Across the kitchen island, Michael sat with a newspaper spread out in front of him, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. He glanced at her briefly, as if about to say something, but thought better of it and returned to the article he wasn't really reading. "Your coffee's ready," Emilia said without looking up. "Thanks," Michael replied, his voice neutral, almost mechanical. This was how their mornings unfolded now. Polite, efficient, and devoid of the warmth they once shared. Their evenings weren't much different. After long hours at work, Emilia would come home to find Michael already settled on the couch, watching the news or scrolling on his phone. She often carried her laptop to the dining table, answering emails while he ate dinner in front of the television. One night, after hours of silence, Emilia closed her laptop and looked at Michael. "Do you think we've changed?" she asked hesitantly. He looked at her, startled. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," she said, shrugging. "It just feels like we're not the same anymore." Michael's face softened, but his response was measured. "We're both busy. It's normal for things to settle after a while." His words felt dismissive, and Emilia didn't press further. Instead, she picked up her plate and carried it to the sink, the feeling of unease settling in her chest like a stone. Michael, too, felt the distance between them, but he didn't know how to bridge it. At work, he found himself lingering in the break room with Jessica more often than he should. Jessica was new to the firm, a junior analyst who radiated kindness. Unlike Emilia, who was always focused on the next goal, Jessica seemed genuinely interested in the small things, how his day was going, what books he liked, even the kind of coffee he drank. "Let me guess," she said one day, smiling as she leaned against the counter. "Black coffee, no sugar." Michael chuckled. "Is it that obvious?" She tilted her head, mock serious. "You seem like someone who likes things simple." "No, fuss." He laughed, and for the first time in a long while it felt natural. Their conversation started innocently enough, work projects, favorite movies, and childhood memories. But as the weeks passed, Michael realized he was looking forward to seeing Jessica more than he should. Meanwhile, Emilia's days were filled with meetings, deadlines, and the constant pressure to excel. It was on one such stressful afternoon that she ducked into a quiet cafe near her office for a rare moment of reprieve. The cafe was small but inviting, with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the hum of low conversations. Emilia ordered a cappuccino and took a seat by the window, pulling out a book she hadn't touched in weeks. "The Great Gatsby," a voice said, pulling her attention away from the page. She looked up to see a man standing beside her table. He was tall, with dark hair and an easy smile. He gestured to her book. "One of my favorites." Emilia smiled politely. "Mine too. It's been a while since I've read it, though." "Mind if I join you?" he asked, motioning to the empty chair across from her. She hesitated but nodded. "Sure." He introduced himself as Robert, and their conversation flowed effortlessly. He had a way of speaking that was both engaging and disarming, weaving humor and insight into every topic they touched on. "You seem like someone who works too hard," he said at one point, his gaze steady. Emilia laughed lightly. "Is it that obvious?" "A little," Robert admitted. "But I think it's more than that. You seem restless." His words caught her off guard, striking a chord she didn't expect. She glanced at her watch, realizing she had been talking to him for nearly an hour. "I should get back to work," she said, standing abruptly. Robert rose with her, a warm smile on his face. "Maybe I'll see you here again sometime." As Emilia walked back to her office, her mind replayed their conversation. There was something about Robert that lingered, an ease, a spark she hadn't felt in years. That evening, as she sat across from Michael at the dinner table, she noticed how different things felt. His attention was elsewhere, his responses to her questions brief and distracted. "Long day?" she asked, trying to engage him. "Yeah," he said without elaborating. For the first time, Emilia felt a twinge of resentment. She thought of Robert's warm smile and the way he seemed to see her in a way Michael hadn't in years. Unbeknownst to her, Michael was thinking of Jessica, of her laugh, her kind eyes, and the way she made him feel noticed. As the days turned into weeks, Emilia found herself returning to the cafe more often, hoping to run into Robert. At the same time, Michael's late meetings with Jessica became a regular occurrence. Both were searching for something they couldn't quite name, unaware of how their paths were slowly pulling them further apart. Their crossroads had arrived, and neither could see the storm brewing just ahead. Part 2. Cracks in Trust. The days after Emilia's chance meeting with Robert passed in a haze of restlessness. The memory of their conversation lingered, stirring something within her, a quiet ache she couldn't ignore. Her routine suddenly felt more suffocating, the distance between her and Michael more pronounced. One evening, she found herself at the cafe again, hoping Robert might appear. She told herself it was a coincidence that she simply enjoyed the atmosphere, but the way her pulse quickened at the sight of him entering the room betrayed her true intentions. "You again," Robert said with a grin, stopping at her table. "Do you always spend your evenings reading alone?" Emilia smiled despite herself. "Only when I need a break from reality." He gestured to the chair opposite her. "Mind if I join you? I promise not to ruin your escape." Their conversation flowed as easily as before. Robert had a way of asking questions that made her feel seen, his curiosity unforced and genuine. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" Emilia asked at one point, surprising herself with the honesty of the question. Robert leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Sometimes. But maybe the life you're living is one you settled for, not one you chose." The words hit her like a punch to the chest. She tried to laugh it off, but the truth in them was undeniable. Meanwhile, Michael's connection with Jessica deepened. Their work meetings had become late-night conversations over drinks, each one feeling more intimate than the last. One evening, as they sat in a quiet corner of a bar, Jessica smiled at him, her eyes warm and full of understanding. "You're a good man, Michael. I can tell." Michael felt his throat tighten. "Sometimes I don't feel like one." Jessica reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "We all make mistakes. It doesn't mean we're bad people." Her touch lingered for a moment before she pulled her hand away, her expression clouding with guilt. "I'm sorry. That was inappropriate." Michael shook his head. "No, it's okay. You don't need to apologize." But they both knew they had crossed a line, even if neither wanted to admit it. At home, the tension between Emilia and Michael grew. Emilia's late afternoons at the cafe with Robert became a quiet routine, and though she never told Michael, she felt a growing need to keep those moments for herself. Michael, in turn, found himself hesitating before answering Emilia's questions about his day. He told himself his time with Jessica was innocent, that it didn't mean anything, but deep down he knew that wasn't true. One night, Emilia returned home earlier than usual and found Michael in the kitchen, his phone in hand. She caught a glimpse of the screen before he locked it. A message from Jessica. "Tonight was nice. Thank you for listening." The words sent a chill down Emilia's spine. She didn't say anything at first, instead watching Michael as he set his phone aside and poured himself a glass of water. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone casual. Emilia forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired." Later, as she lay in bed beside him, her mind raced with questions. Who was Jessica? What had Michael been doing with her? And why did he seem so distant? Emilia told herself she needed more evidence before confronting him, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew with every passing day. Robert, meanwhile, began pushing for more from Emilia. Their conversations had grown deeper, their moments together tinged with a tension neither could ignore. One evening, as they walked through the park after coffee, Robert stopped suddenly and turned to her. "You're amazing, you know that?" Emilia laughed lightly, trying to deflect. "I'm just me." "No," he said, his voice firm. "You're so much more than that. You deserve someone who sees you for who you really are, not someone who takes you for granted." The intensity of his words took her breath away. She opened her mouth to respond, but he stepped closer, his gaze locked on hers. "Do you ever think about what it would be like?" he asked softly. What would be like?" she whispered. "Being with someone who makes you feel alive." The question hung in the air, charged with a weight she wasn't ready to face. "I should go," she said, stepping back, her voice unsteady. Robert didn't follow her, but the look in his eyes as she walked away stayed with her long after she left the park. The cracks in trust widened with each passing day. Emilia couldn't shake the growing suspicion about Michael and Jessica, and her moments with Robert were becoming harder to rationalize. Michael, too, wrestled with his guilt, torn between his loyalty to Emilia and the comfort he found in Jessica's presence. And Jessica, though hesitant, found herself looking forward to their time together, even as the weight of their connection pressed down on her. None of them knew how much further they could go before everything shattered. But the breaking point was closer than they realized. Part 3. Masks Remove. The air in the living room felt heavier than usual as Emilia sat on the edge of the couch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Across from her, Michael leaned against the dining table, his phone in his hand, a phone she now knew contained more than work emails. "I need to ask you something," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside. Michael frowned. "What is it? Who's Jessica?" The question hit him like a jolt, and his expression faltered for a split second before he caught himself. "She's a colleague," he replied carefully. "We've been working on a big project together." Emilia stood, her heart pounding as she faced him. "Then why is she texting you late at night? Why is she thanking you for listening?" Michael stiffened. "I told you it's work. She's going through some personal stuff, and I've been trying to help her." "Help her?" Emilia's voice rose, disbelief cutting through her words. "You're spending late nights with her, texting her, and keeping it from me. How is that just work?" Michael ran a hand through his hair, frustration breaking through his calm exterior. "Nothing physical has happened, Emilia. I promise you that." Her laugh was bitter, almost cruel. "But you wanted it to, didn't you?" Michael froze, his silence louder than any denial could have been. The argument stretched late into the night, both of them throwing accusations and defenses, until they had exhausted their voices. Michael finally sat down at the dining table, his head in his hands. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said quietly. "But I felt invisible for so long, Emilia. Jessica, she listens. She doesn't judge me." Emilia's chest tightened, his words cutting deeper than she expected. "And what about me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Do you think I don't feel invisible too? Do you think I haven't felt lonely?" Michael looked up at her, surprise flickering in his eyes, but Emilia couldn't bear to stay in the room any longer. She grabbed her coat and left, the door slamming behind her. Emilia found herself walking aimlessly through the city streets, the cold night air biting at her skin. Without thinking, she pulled out her phone and texted Robert. "Can we meet?" Minutes later, they were sitting across from each other in the quiet cafe where they had first met. Robert studied her carefully, his eyes full of concern. "What happened?" he asked softly. Emilia shook her head, tears threatening to spill. "Michael, there's someone else," he says. "It's nothing physical, but I don't know." Robert leaned forward, his hand covering hers on the table. "You deserve better than this, Emilia. You know that, right?" She looked up at him, the intensity in his gaze stirring something deep within her. "I don't know what I deserve anymore," she admitted. "You deserve to be happy," he said firmly. But you won't find that if you keep holding on to something that's already broken. His words stayed with her long after they left the cafe. Jessica, meanwhile, had no idea how close her world was to colliding with Emilia's. She spent most of her days trying to avoid Michael at work, guilt gnawing at her every time she saw him. But one afternoon, as she scrolled through social media, something caught her. A photo of Emilia tagged at an art gallery. Emilia stood next to a man Jessica didn't recognize, his arm resting casually on the back of her chair. The caption read, "A refreshing perspective." Something about the photo unsettled Jessica. The man's confident smile and the way Emilia leaned toward him spoke of familiarity, too much familiarity. Her curiosity got the better of her. Using a mutual connection, she discovered the man's name, Robert. She hesitated before reaching out, but her instincts wouldn't let her ignore it. When Jessica and Robert met at a downtown cafe, the tension between them was immediate. Jessica introduced herself under the pretense of business, but her questions soon turned personal. "You know Emilia, don't you?" she asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. Robert raised an eyebrow, his smile never faltering. "I do. Why do you ask?" Jessica leaned forward. "Because I think there's more going on than you're letting on." Robert chuckled, the sound cold and dismissive. "And what exactly do you think is going on?" Jessica didn't back down. "I think you're playing her. I think you see someone vulnerable and you're taking advantage of it." His smile faded, replaced by a steely gaze. "You don't know anything about me or about her, so maybe you should mind your own business." Jessica stood, her heart racing. "I may not know everything, but I know enough, and I'll make sure Emilia knows too." As she walked away, Jessica's mind raced. She had come to confront Robert, but now she felt an obligation to warn Emilia before it was too late. By the time Emilia returned home that evening, Michael was already asleep on the couch. She watched him for a moment, the lines of exhaustion etched into his face making him look older than she remembered. Her phone buzzed with a message from Robert. "Thinking of you." The tension in her life was becoming unbearable. She was torn between the safe familiarity of her marriage and the thrilling uncertainty Robert offered. But deep down, she knew she couldn't keep straddling the line. The masks were slipping, and the truths they all tried to hide were beginning to emerge. The question was, how much more could they endure before everything fell apart? Part 4. The Peak of Betrayal. The rain came down in steady sheets as Emilia sat across from Robert in his dimly lit apartment. The hum of the city outside was muffled by the thick curtains, cocooning them in a bubble of intimacy. "I can't go home tonight," Emilia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert leaned forward, his hand brushing hers. "You don't have to," he said softly, his gaze locking with hers. "Stay." The words carried a weight she wasn't ready to face. For weeks, their connection had hovered just outside the boundaries of her marriage, but this moment felt like a point of no return. Her thoughts flickered briefly to Michael, to the strained, empty silences and the anger simmering beneath their interactions. "Do you ever think about what we could be?" Robert asked, his voice breaking through her hesitation. "If you weren't holding on to something that's already broken?" His words felt like both a lifeline and a challenge. Before she could think, before she could stop herself, Emilia leaned in, her lips meeting his. The kiss was tentative at first, but it deepened quickly, the unspoken tension between them igniting into something neither of them could deny. As the hours slipped by, Emilia knew she had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. The next morning, Emilia left Robert's apartment early, the weight of her decision pressing heavily on her chest. At home, she found Michael already in the kitchen, sipping his coffee in silence. "Where were you last night?" he asked without looking up. "I needed some space," she replied, her voice steady but her heart pounding. Michael didn't press further, but the unspoken question lingered between them. Michael, too, was reaching his breaking point. The distance between him and Emilia had grown unbearable, and Jessica's rejection had left him feeling adrift. Desperate for clarity, he called Jessica one evening, asking her to meet him at the park near their office. When she arrived, Jessica's expression was guarded, her hands stuffed into the pockets of her coat. "Michael, why are we here?" "I need to say this," Michael began, his voice trembling. "I know things have been complicated, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel something for you." Jessica's face softened, but her eyes were filled with sadness. "Michael, just hear me out," he interrupted. "I've been so lost in my marriage, and with you I feel seen. I feel like I matter." Jessica shook her head, her voice breaking. "You do matter. But I can't be this for you, Michael. I can't be the reason your marriage ends." "It's already over," he said, his voice rising with desperation. "We're just going through the motions at this point." Jessica stepped back, tears welling in her eyes. "Even if that's true, it doesn't make this right. I can't do this." She turned and walked away, leaving Michael standing alone in the cold. Emilia, meanwhile, was beginning to see cracks in her relationship with Robert. What had once felt like an escape now carried a weight she hadn't anticipated. "You're distracted," Robert said one evening as they sat on his couch. "I'm just tired," Emilia replied, avoiding his gaze. "No, it's more than that," he pressed. "You're still thinking about him, aren't you?" Emilia froze. "Robert, this isn't as simple as you want it to be." "It could be," he countered, his voice hardening. "But you're holding on to something that's already dead. Why can't you just let it go?" The intensity in his words unsettled her. "You don't understand," she said, standing to leave. "No, I do understand," Robert said, his tone sharp. "You want to have it both ways. But that's not how this works, Emilia. You need to make a choice." The confrontation left her shaken. As she walked home, Emilia couldn't shake the feeling that Robert's charm had been masking something darker. That night, unable to sleep, Emilia scrolled through her messages, rereading the ones she had exchanged with Robert. For the first time, she felt a pang of doubt. Had she traded one broken connection for another? Her thoughts turned to Michael. Despite everything, she couldn't deny the years they had shared, the moments of love and stability that felt so distant now. The memory of his kind smile and steady presence lingered, a reminder of what she had thrown away. Michael and Emilia's marriage officially ended the next week when she handed him divorce papers. "I think this is for the best," she said, her voice shaking. Michael stared at the papers, the weight of them sinking in. "Maybe it is," he said quietly. As he signed, neither of them could bring themselves to look at the other. In the days that followed, Robert grew more distant, his messages becoming less frequent, and his tone colder. One evening, Emilia arrived at his apartment only to find it empty, his belongings gone without a trace. He left no note, no explanation, just silence. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She had risked everything for Robert, only to discover he had been using her as much as she had used him. Alone in her apartment, Emilia stared at the divorce papers on her kitchen table, her mind swirling with regret. She had thought leaving Michael would bring her happiness. But now, she felt more lost than ever. For Michael, the end of his marriage marked the beginning of an uncertain chapter. He thought of Jessica often, but her rejection had been clear, and he respected her decision to step away. As he packed up his belongings and moved into a small apartment downtown, he found himself reflecting on the choices that had brought him here. He had searched for validation outside his marriage, but in the end, it had left him emptier than before. The peak of their betrayals had left both Emilia and Michael broken, their lives irrevocably changed, and the fallout was only beginning. Part 5. Ruins. The finality of their divorce hit Emilia the moment she walked into the now empty apartment. Michael's belongings were gone, leaving behind bare shelves and quiet, hollow spaces that seemed to echo with the life they had once shared. The sofa where they had spent countless evenings was still there, but now it felt like a relic of a time she could no longer touch. Emilia dropped her bag by the door and sank onto the sofa, her fingers trailing over the frayed edge of a throw pillow. She thought back to the early years of their marriage, when the silences between them were filled with comfort instead of tension. She had taken those moments for granted, too distracted by her career and ambitions to notice the cracks forming. Beneath the surface, her phone buzzed, breaking the stillness. She glanced at the screen, hoping against hope that it might be Robert, but it was just another work email, a reminder of a deadline that felt trivial in the face of everything else. Robert's disappearance had been swift and unceremonious. No goodbye, no explanation, just an empty apartment and unanswered calls. Emilia had thought she meant more to him, that their connection was different. But now, staring into the void he'd left behind, she realized how wrong she'd been. Michael's new apartment was modest but functional, a far cry from the home he had shared. With Emilia, the walls were bare, the furniture sparse, a space that felt more like a temporary stop than a place to rebuild his life. He spent his evenings unpacking boxes and ignoring the ache that lingered in his chest. Every item he pulled from the boxes carried a memory. Shared vacations, holidays, the mundane routines of a life he had once cherished. One night, he came across an old photo of him and Emilia from their honeymoon. They were sitting on a rocky beach, their faces flushed with laughter and the thrill of possibility. Michael stared at the photo for a long time before tucking it into the back of a drawer. Despite the finality of the divorce, he couldn't stop thinking about Jessica. Her rejection still stung, but it was her integrity that he admired most. She had been honest with him in a way that he hadn't been with himself or Emilia for a long time. Jessica had left the city shortly after the divorce was finalized. The whispers at work, the guilt of her involvement with Michael, and the weight of her own choices had become too much to bear. Her new apartment in a small coastal town was bright and airy, a sharp contrast to the heaviness she carried inside. She spent her days volunteering at a local nonprofit, helping others in an attempt to silence the voice in her head that whispered she didn't deserve a fresh start. One afternoon, as she walked along the beach, Jessica thought about Michael. She missed him in a way that surprised her, not just his kindness but the way he made her feel seen. And yet, she knew that staying in his life would have only prolonged the pain for both of them. For Emilia, the days blurred into one another. She threw herself into work, taking on project after project to avoid the emptiness waiting for her at home. But no amount of deadlines or accolades could fill the void Robert had left. One evening, Emilia found herself scrolling through old photos on her phone. There was one of her and Michael at a friend's wedding, both of them dressed to the nines and smiling at the camera. She barely recognized the woman in the photo, so full of hope and certainty. She wondered if they could have saved their marriage, if she hadn't sought escape in Robert, if she had tried harder to reach Michael before it was too late. The thought brought tears to her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Michael, too, was struggling to make sense of his new reality. He had started seeing a therapist, hoping to untangle the knots of guilt, regret, and loneliness that seemed to define his days. In one session, his therapist asked him, "If you could say one thing to Emilia now, what would it be?" Michael hesitated, the words catching in his throat. Finally, he said, "I'm sorry for not trying harder, for not being honest about what I needed." The admission felt like a weight lifting, but it also left behind a lingering sadness. Jessica, meanwhile, was beginning to find her footing in her new life. She had made friends through her volunteer work and started a small garden on the balcony of her apartment. The simplicity of it brought her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. Still, the past wasn't so easily forgotten. One evening, she sat down and wrote a letter to Michael. "I'm sorry for how things ended. You're a good man, and you deserve happiness. I hope you find it." She never sent the letter. As the months passed, the lives of Emilia, Michael, and Jessica remained intertwined only by the memories they carried. Emilia sat alone in her apartment. Michael navigated the quiet of his new life, and Jessica built a new chapter far from the city. Each of them was left to grapple with the ruins of what had been, searching for a way to rebuild amidst the rubble. But the scars of betrayal ran deep, and moving forward would take more than time. It would take courage, reflection, and a willingness to face the bitter truth of their choices. Part 6. The Bitter Truth. The autumn air was crisp as Emilia walked through the park near her office, the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot echoing in the stillness. She had started taking these walks after work, finding solace in the quiet moments of reflection they offered. Her life had changed so much in the past year, and for the first time she was beginning to understand why. As she sat on a bench overlooking a small pond, she thought back to the choices she had made, the distances she had allowed to grow between herself and Michael, the risks she had taken with Robert, the lies she had told herself to justify it all. She had sought something she couldn't even name, a spark, a sense of being alive. And yet, in her pursuit, she had destroyed the stability that had once grounded her. "I thought I wanted freedom," she whispered to herself, "but all I did was run away." The realization was bitter, but it was hers. For too long she had blamed Michael, Robert, even the pressures of her career. Now, sitting alone with only her thoughts, she understood that the choices had been hers all along. Michael's new life was quieter than he had expected. His small apartment had begun to feel more like home, and his therapy sessions were helping him unpack the emotions he had buried for years. One evening, he sat by the window, sipping tea and looking out at the city lights. His therapist's question from weeks ago still lingered in his mind. What would you say to Emilia now? He thought about their marriage, the laughter, the love, the moments of joy that had been overshadowed by resentment and miscommunication. He thought about Jessica, too, and the way she had shown him a kindness he hadn't realized he needed. But most of all, he thought about himself. For years, he had been afraid to confront what he wanted, hiding behind work and the routines of married life. It was easier to blame Emilia than to admit his own failings. "I should have fought harder," he said aloud to the empty room. "For her, for us, for me." The admission was painful, but it felt like a step toward healing. Jessica's life in the coastal town had taken on a steady rhythm. Her days were filled with volunteer work, her evenings spent tending to her balcony garden or reading by the window, as the ocean breeze drifted in. But the memories of the city, of Michael and Emilia, still lingered. She thought often of the role she had played in their story, the lines she had crossed and the pain she had caused. One night, as she sat on her balcony under the stars, she opened her journal and began to write. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I thought I was helping, but I was selfish. I wanted to be seen, to matter to someone, and I didn't think about what it would cost. I hope they both find peace. I hope I can, too." The words felt like a release, a small step toward forgiving herself. Months later, Emilia and Michael crossed paths for the first time since the divorce. It was at a mutual friends event, a gathering neither had planned to attend but both felt obligated to. They spotted each other across the room, and for a moment the noise of the party seemed to fade. Michael was the first to approach, his smile tentative but genuine. "Emilia," he said, his voice soft. "Michael," she replied, her heart fluttering with a mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Emilia spoke. "How have you been?" "Better," Michael said. "It's been a process, but I think I'm getting there." She nodded. "Me too." Their conversation was brief, filled with polite exchanges and lingering glances. But as they parted ways that night, Emilia felt a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. The truth they had both come to understand was simple yet profound. Their marriage had failed not because of one moment, one betrayal, or one person, but because of a series of choices and missed opportunities to fight for each other. For Emilia, the journey ahead was about rebuilding not just her life, but her sense of self. She had spent so long trying to be everything for everyone that she had forgotten how to be herself. For Michael, it was about learning to forgive, not just Emilia, but himself. He had found strength in vulnerability and was slowly learning to open his heart again. And for Jessica, it was about letting go of the past and allowing herself to believe in second chances. The coastal town she now called home wasn't just a place to hide. It was a place to start over. The ruins of their shared story remained, but from those ruins, each of them began to rebuild. The scars of betrayal would never fully fade, but they served as reminders of the lessons they had learned, the importance of honesty, the danger of taking love for granted, and the courage it takes to move forward. Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones that set us free.